for joining us today. My name is Andrea Lovoll. I'm the Legislative Director here at MCEA. I'm really excited to have this group of people here to talk about environmental justice legislation happening this session. And it's going to be a really great conversation. So I appreciate everybody being here. So we'll get started. This conversation is fueled by all of our MCEA supporters. So I wanted to take a minute to thank you all for your support that allows us to do this work, as well as our work in regulatory agencies, at the legislature, in the courts. Please consider a contribution to make more of this work possible if you are so moved. So here's what we have planned today. We're talking about how MCEA is having at its core the environmental justice work. And so we'll have an introduction from our new program director on healthy communities. We will also be hearing from critical advocates in the environmental justice space at the legislature, what's moving, why it's important, and how you can help. And then at the end, we'll hold about 15 minutes for audience questions. So I would encourage you to submit your questions in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And we will do our best to address those questions as they come in at the end of the presentation. So we'll go ahead and get into some introductions. Again, my name is Andrea Lovoll. I'm the Legislative Director here. And as we do introductions, I would really like for everyone to answer the question of how are you connected to environmental justice work? And so I'll get started. I am really passionate about environmental justice work. I grew up in EJ communities, and so in the communities that are listed as EJ areas. And so I'm very passionate about this work because that's my community members, that's where I grew up. And so this is really personal for me. Next we have Evan Mulholland. Evan, will you introduce yourself and tell us how you got involved in environmental justice work?
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. And I just want to say thank you to Andrea for coordinating all of our legislative work this year. This is a big year and she's doing an excellent job. So props to Andrea. So I'm Evan Mulholland. I'm our new Healthy Communities Program Director. I'm an environmental lawyer by training. I've worked for a bunch of years, 11 years at the state of New Hampshire. And for the last 4 years, I've been here with MCEA. And for me, environmental justice has been a process of educating myself about the just complete unfairness of the system we're operating in. And once you see the sort of structural racism in this country that shows up as a pattern of concentrated pollution, air pollution, water pollution, even noise pollution, excessive heat pollution, you can't unsee that pattern. And for me, I don't want to just study the problem sort of academically. I want to be part of the work. And so in my role here at MCEA and as Healthy Communities Director, I get to do that. And I get to advocate alongside people like Roxxanne and Sophia here with us today. So thanks.
Great, thank you, Evan. I would like to now turn it over to Sophia. Sophia, will you introduce yourself and tell us about how you got involved in environmental justice work?
Hi y'all, thanks for having me. Sophia Benrud, my pronouns are they and she, and yeah, I work at the Minnesota Environmental Justice Table. How I entered, I think it's a messy pathway in environmental justice. I think I was doing organizing around environmental justice before I knew what that word meant. I think that people thought it was, when I used to say environmental justice, people were like environmentalism, and I was like, no, that's not really what I'm talking about here. So actually my pathway into EJ was actually through line 3, and my pathway into organizing specifically was through abolition work, police abolition work, and really found the intersections of what both of those look like, especially through, how the state upholds the control of land and corporate power through sheriff's departments and police and other things like that. So that's kind of how I found my way into EJ as a whole, but definitely a child that had lead poisoning and also experienced other different Injustices of the system throughout my life that are very related to environment and space. So yeah.
Thank you, Sophia. And now I'd like to pass it to Roxxanne. Roxxanne, will you tell us a bit about yourself and your connection to environmental justice work?
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Roxxanne O'Brien, and I am an EJ organizer, environmental justice organizer, based and from North Minneapolis. I started because my community was facing an industrial like river area. We have an industrial corridor along our Mississippi River in North Minneapolis. And although I didn't know that we had like this cumulative impact going on in our communities, I had started to hear information that one specific facility, Northern Metals, was trying to increase their emissions by 1,000%. And that was enough to get me involved in my community. I was already a community organizer trained by Hope Community and working with different organizations around housing issues, police brutality issues, domestic violence issues, just all type of issues. And this issue came out to me at least around 2010, and ever since then, I've had to open up my eyes to a lot more things, like the processes, how these things are happened in our communities. So it's been quite the journey, and yeah, that's how I started. Just mad as heck, and wanted to do something about it to make sure that this didn't happen to my community ever again, or other communities.
Yeah, I see a thorough line in all of us, and that is that we've all seen the unfairness that exists in the system, and some folks have experienced that firsthand, and it's definitely anger is a feeling that comes out especially when you first get going. So I definitely see a thorough line of everybody on this call who is talking with us today on this panel. So I'd like to start by talking a little bit, grounding us a little bit in MCEA's work, since we have a lot of folks who are listening today as MCEA supporters. Our environmental justice work is kind of new to MCEA, and we've just recently started a new program of healthy communities, which encompasses our environmental justice work. And so that is in part why Evan is here on this call, is to talk about the Healthy Communities program and how environmental justice work is central to that. So I'd like to ask Evan a question first. Tell me a little bit about the goal of the Healthy Communities program at MCEA, and what are you trying to achieve with this program?
Thanks, Andrea. We have a lot of goals, and they're pretty far-reaching. We want to end injustice in Minnesota, especially around environmental injustice. So how do we do that? For us, environmental justice is about people. So we look at how people are benefited and or burdened by a specific government policy or a permitting decision. And when you have Black communities, Indigenous communities, low-income communities, people of color systematically burdened by pollution and land use decisions, that's a sort of environmental injustice we're focused on. And the laws we have in place now, we're going to talk about this, have resulted in this type of overburden and concentration of pollution. And one of our goals at MCEA is to change these laws and end this particular type of injustice.
So why do we call it healthy communities and not just environmental justice, if that's what's the focus of this program?
It's a good question, Andrea, and we thought a lot about this when we sort of launched this last year. It's because at MCEA, we see environmental justice as part of all of our work. Like, you know, we've got climate and energy program, water policy program, mining in Northeast Minnesota program, and environmental justice and this sort of structural racism shows up across the board in all these programs. And so the response has to be woven into all the programs. Like we can't just put environmental justice in one box and talk about it only on Thursdays. It doesn't work that way. So, but of all the programs, the Healthy Community Program is really focused on partnerships with impacted communities to leverage our resources for the communities who are being harmed and working in alignment with them. And that's what we're trying to do with this program.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Can you tell me like what some of the projects are that is focused on in this program?
Yeah, we've got a bunch of things we're working on. I'll be really brief. One is the Frontline Community Protection Coalition and the statewide cumulative impacts bill we're going to talk about in a minute. Also important is our ongoing work with CMEJ and Roxxanne on the new recodification of the Minneapolis zoning code. And we're trying to make sure that the new rules they're developing for the whole city protects North and South green zones from more industrial pollution and also makes the process more fair. And I want to just briefly mention our work with the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe in north central Minnesota near Cohasset. We, MCEA lawyers, represented the band in one part of their fight against this giant new plywood factory you might have read about in the news. So we had a big win last week. On Monday, we heard the Court of Appeals ruled in our favor. And then on Thursday, the corporate developer of this plant announced it was dropping all its plans to build the factory right there in Cohasset. So it's a good thing.
Cool. I think that's a really good segue into the next part of this conversation, which is I think why everybody is probably attending this webinar today, is to really talk about these bills that are moving at the legislature. And so I'd like to shift over to the work that we're doing. We're a member of the Frontline Community Protection Coalition. And so we really want to use this platform to talk about this bill that has some really strong promise this session. So I wonder if, Sophia, you've been in this coalition much longer than I have. I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about the history of the coalition and what this cumulative impacts bill is about.
Yeah, I actually am wondering if we want to start with the history of how the bill came to Minnesota, and then we jump into the coalition.
Sure, I think that's maybe that's a better way to do it. So yeah, let's start there. Let's talk about how this bill came to Minnesota.
And I think Roxxanne has a really solid idea because Roxxanne was one of the people that brought it here.
Thanks, Sophia, for that. And yeah, so sometime around 2018, a conversation was had with Foley around, I think I had a conversation with Foley about possibly doing a cumulative impact ordinance. Now, the idea is, I mean, it's national. There's groups all over the nation passing this bill. Shout outs to New Jersey and New York, who have been really looking at how they pass theirs and what they have in theirs as their strong language, looking at what they are asking for and kind of looking up to them on how they did it. So we've been working with folks, not just inside of Minnesota, but this comes from years of EJ work. And one of the people I also want to give a shout out to, Shalini Gupta, who's in India right now with some of the highest pollution levels. Like I know in my neighborhood, it's like, you know, like maybe the threshold is 40 or something. And like in India, it's like 300, you know, like it's pretty bad out there. So shout outs to her, who has been a support, like just our research guru. And she's actually the one who told me to, you know, see if Foley would be interested. And he was. He was my state rep at the time for North Minneapolis. And he continues to be an EJ champion out here, listening to residents, paying attention to residents, our needs, our concerns, our desires for our communities, and helping to put that into bill format. So, you know, I'm not a policy person per se. I have been involved in lots of policy, but it's not my expertise. And you know, this is what public officials should do. So that's what he did for us. He put together some language. He also, I think we've connected him with Karen Clark too, I believe, because Karen Clark has some history around cumulative impact work in policy in Phillips community and on the south side of Minneapolis. So shout outs to our neighbors out there who are going through similar things with the roof depot, Smith's Boundaries. A lot of this work came about from all the stories and the struggles, the EJ struggles that we're going through in our community. So whether it was Northern Metals or HERC or GAF, Smith's Foundry, Excel Energy, you know, asphalt places, all these things create this cumulative impact in our communities, this accumulation of toxins and emissions, and just creates this toxic soup on top of all the burdens and inequities that we go through already in our communities. And I think it was like a no-brainer for FOO. Like, why wouldn't we do something, a bill that would impact our communities in a positive way? So we just started to work on it. And at some point, I know FOO had kind of passed it off to another public official, I think Representative Herr. So it's been through a lot of transition over the years. But the good thing about that is just lots of energy and excitement and movement happening from a lot of different people, coalitions, and public officials now are like on top of it. So it may have started out as just like a North Side EJ bill, but as you can see, it's growing now. So I do want to let Sophia talk about some of the work that's been happening soon, because I know CMEJ, Community Members for Environmental Justice, although we helped begin this, we have not been the only ones thinking about it or working on it since then. So I know we've kicked back a little bit, waiting for the Senate to change so that we could actually pass this bill. And now that we have a good looking Senate, we are thinking that we might be successful this year. So hats off to everyone who's been doing the work. And I'll pass it to Sophia so she could tell you more.
Me, always taking notes on the side. Yeah, so thank you for like laying all of that out. I just think it's really important to honor also just in the storyline of legislative work in general. Throughout history, a lot of it comes from like a top-down perspective, and I really think that one of the reasons why the Minnesota Environmental Justice Table was so passionate and excited about this was because it's actually a call from community saying, hey, this is actually going to support us, which is just a very different form of like policy blooming alongside community efforts and work. So yeah, I just think that that's one thing to shine light on too, is it's magic. I'm really excited about this bill. So the Cumulative Impacts Frontline Protections Coalition has been working on this bill. There is a compilation of many folks. I'm not going to sit here and list off every single one because transparently, I don't even have the list, because there's a lot of folks and there's more folks being added currently, but really excited because the MCEA has been working really hard on this. Copal has been leading this effort, and the Minnesota Environmental Justice Table, the ME Partnership, Clean Water Action are among some of them, some folks from the Sierra Club. And so it's really been an effort of love, a labor of love, of working through language and really alignment in this coalition towards working towards, cumulative impacts and this bill and what it's going to do, which I think we're probably going to talk about soon.
Yeah, I think one of the things that that always strikes me about this bill is whenever I talk to like friends and family and like community members that I grew up with about this bill, they always assume that the MPCA is already doing this. So you say like, oh, so this bill would make sure that the MPCA has to take into account what other pollution is in the area. And the response I always get is, wait, the MPCA doesn't do that already? And so I think it really highlights this need that we have to do things that we're expecting our government agencies to do. We're expecting them to do this kind of work. And so I wonder if we could pivot to kind of a question for any panelist to say, why do we need this bill? Like, what problem does it solve? And, why is this necessary? What's the history of why we have to do this? Anybody want to step in? This is a question for just about anybody.
I can speak to it a little bit. Why do we need this bill? Well, I think policies and has historically been the way that this country operates around doing anything. So laws, legal language, which has not been community friendly at all. But yeah, in order to get people who have the power to do something, you have to speak their language. And so we had to come up with a bill that used all this fancy language to just basically say, can you stop murdering people by chemicals in our community? Historically, we've carried all of the burdens because of racism and classism and numerous other issues of greed. And so this is our community's way of having to jump in the game of, if we wanted to change things happening in our communities, we're going to have to change these laws. Also simultaneously organizing and engaging with community to make sure that community understands what we're doing here. It wasn't exactly my idea to do a cumulative impact ordinance or a bill, which I just kind of gave you a sneak peek. We also would like to pass one at the city level, because the cumulative impacts bill pretty much has power at the state level. In the MCEA, it has a lot to do with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. But a cumulative level, a municipal cumulative impact ordinance. Oh my God, you see these words? A municipal level cumulative impact ordinance would also address some of the things that the city can do. But they're both important. And it's unfortunate that we have to create a lot of policies in different jurisdictions in order for people to get on the same page. But I don't know how else we're going to do it. I think Evan talked a little bit about zoning law changes that are happening right now at the municipal level, at the city level, and we have been just pretty much tag teaming any possible avenue or a pathway to get to our goals. We don't just do just one bill. I think we have quite a few bills and policies and organizing happening behind the scenes. It's a lot of work, but it's one part of the work. So we need it.
Andrea, and thanks, Roxxanne. Can I just jump in on just something about the Clean Air Act that people may not know, which is when you go to get, let's say, so the problem is you have a bunch of facilities all in the same area. We're down in Southside Green Zone, East Phillips, there's a lot of polluting facilities. North Side, there's a lot of polluting facilities. And other places in the state, there are these concentrations of major sources of air pollution. And with the way the Clean Air Act works is that the Federal Clean Air Act implemented through the state PCA is that the emission standards are independent of the background pollution levels. So let's say you want to emit some carcinogen or some VOC or some chemical that's harmful for people. As long as you keep it below a certain level in your stack, in your pipe, then that's fine. no one is looking at no one is looking at two things. What's the concentration of that particular chemical from all the other factories around? And also no one's looking at, well, what's the interaction between these chemicals on people's health that live nearby? So that's what we're trying to get at here. And the basic concept of this, I'll flip this to you guys, but it's like, if you have a place with a lot of pollution already that's harming people already, then we should look really, really hard before we add any more, and really, you shouldn't add any more. That's the idea. Sophia, you want to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm just going to talk to exactly what it is, because I see a question in the Q&A of like, what is it? What are you talking about? So I think just like the overall overarching like goal of cumulative impacts bill is to say, hey, we have overburdened communities that historically have been overburdened over time. And we want to stop the pollution before it can even happen, because what I also see is communities, after something is placed in, the decisions have already been made, then people, from those communities are like, excuse me, we never wanted this, why is this here? And so this bill is actually hoping on the forefront to actually stop and halt those different polluting entities from entering in and like building and taking up space and polluting those communities moving forward. So it is surrounding around, just for context, it's surrounding around the permit process of how bills get permits to actually pollute, essentially. And I think a really key example of this in like real life is the Herc incinerator was supposed to be put into a different community. Originally, it was supposed to be put into a different community, a more wealthy community, the wealthier community that has different levels of privilege and finance, fought it off, and then it ended up in North Minneapolis. And now we've had the Herc incinerator for years, decades at this point. And now people have been fighting that for decades since it started. So I think that is just like contextually how we're like, hey, we don't want to be fighting on the back end. We're like, let's just stop this on the front end from moving forward.
I really like that you use the example of the HERC because I think that there's a lot of conversation now starting to happen around the HERC and how this bill would interact with things like the HERC. So if I can ask you a follow-up question, Sophia. So the HERC incinerator in this area, like, why was it such a big deal that it was in North Minneapolis as opposed to this other community? I know you have information on that. That's why I'm asking the question.
Well, Northside historically, as Roxxanne was pointing out, and Roxanne's from Northside, so I'm like, hey, I'm sure you have plenty to say about this, but also has the highest rates of asthma in Minnesota. And so I think, we're just holding space for the fact that this is an air polluter. HERC incinerator is an air polluter. It's putting toxins out into the air. This is also a whole entire for the Hennepin County. This is Hennepin County. This could have gone anywhere in Hennepin County, and they deliberately chose to put it in the middle of the city, which they also turn off for Twins games. So they know it's bad. They know it's bad for the air, but clearly not bad enough for them to turn it off during other points in time, like a pandemic that's attacking people's lungs. And that there's high rates of asthma all around the HERC incinerator. So I think that there is multiple layers to that answer. And I'm sure there's even more that Roxxanne could probably answer around that too.
I think you did a good job.
Oh, I'm sorry. And also, I really hate acronyms. So I think this is a farce, technically. But the HERC incinerator is technically called the Hennepin Energy Recovery Center, just so people actually know what acronym we're using when we're using it.
Yeah, so it's a trash incinerator that also generates some electricity, is basically how it's a recovery. Yeah. So great. So I'm seeing a question in the chat that I think is really relevant to this overall discussion about, you know, why we need this bill. And maybe Evan can answer this question. Why hasn't the MPCA done this yet? Why haven't they been successful at you know, their permitting decisions in taking into account cumulative impacts harms?
I mean, a really simple answer is no one's required them to do it, like the legislature. They are required to follow the laws that they have. So in order to make them consider cumulative impact and not add pollution to already overburdened neighborhoods, like Roxxanne and Sophia were saying, I mean, that's one answer. I'm going to see what Roxxanne asked, I think.
I just discovered the chat, y'all. So I was like, oh, there's the questions. I was looking for the questions. Okay. So I wasn't paying attention. I'm sorry. I was looking for
I think the question is, how come PCA has not done this yet? And one of the things I answered, Roxxanne, was, well, they haven't been required to by the law yet. You know, they are required to follow the laws, and they're an implementing agency, right? So they have to do whatever the legislature tells them, and they haven't told them to do this yet. That's one reason, sort of a structural reason, but there are bigger reasons too.
Yeah, I mean, political reasons. I think there has to be a political will. People have to be uncomfortable and upset about it or angry about it. Not much movement happens from people being sad or sending thoughts and prayers. No changes don't happen from that. They happen from people being upset and angry and saying this is wrong and speaking about that harm and making people uncomfortable. If community members have to be uncomfortable, then people should have to hear about it. And I think that's what happened is I think we continue to push education around the community. I know community members for environmental justice does EJ tours all the time. And every time we talk about the cumulative impact ordinance, I mean, this is how we engage people and educate them on all the issues that are happening, on all the stops, all the facilities in our communities that are harming us. We go around, we talk about some of the harms, some of the victories, but I think we have to move people. We have to make people understand what's going on. Sometimes I think ignorance gets the best of our country from people just not knowing, not doing the homework, not educating themselves, not doing that internal work, around racism. We've all internalized racism. Racism is harmful to us all. Classism is harmful to us all. And I think a lot of these issues stem from those things. I think MPCA has been operating just at a level of, we're not going to do anything unless we're pushed to do it. So I think that's what happened. It's not like I think they came up one day and decided we're going to do the right thing. I think people had to actually motivate them by just staying at it, constantly having meetings. I mean, I know for myself, I've been educating people for at least 10 years, 10, 11 years around these EJ issues. So, and Northern Metals, just left in 2022. So things take time, and it's unfortunate that they take so long. I think that's what we're trying to do today, right? Like everybody here has a part and a role and power and money and time, and donate that. And sometimes, I mean, money is very important, especially for people on the front lines, especially for our attorneys. MCEA is very supportive to our work, and I think that it's important to put your money where your mouth is. But I also think it's also important for you to put time into it and to really educate yourself on what's going on, and just put yourself in our shoes. I mean, we all live on the same earth. So what's happening to me is going to affect you eventually, if it already hasn't.
Yeah,
Thanks, Roxxanne.
it's really, I think there is a bigger conversation here too that I think you're both alluding to here, and that is the ways in which our historical racism in Minnesota has played into this environmental harms. And you know, I think it's worth kind of putting out there that like part of the reason that we have to do this legislative work on addressing these environmental harms is that the laws that got us there were written racistly. And so I think it's important to talk about our own history and how we got to this point as being the reason why we need to take these steps. And I wonder if anybody else has something to add to that.
I want to add about the zoning. I think, you know, I don't know everything about zoning, but I think it's really important for people to tap in or to tune in to that conversation happening right now at the city level. Zoning laws came somewhere around 100 years ago. They did some of the work that police did as far as keeping folks segregated and kind of choosing what areas were going to be compromised and exploited, and what areas were going to have fresh air, water, parks, systems, you know, nice parks and greenways, pathways. I think all those things were intentionally designed. So we really have to go back and change the laws that were created by folks who weren't being regulated, or I mean, like folks who were maybe more out there, as you know, with racial covenants and different pieces of legal documents. But I think those things are still there. That's one of the things people are like, oh, this happened 100 years ago. Yeah, but the laws haven't changed. So there's work to be done. Although you might not feel like you have a place in this racist system, if you don't undo the harms from the past, at least as many as you can, then you are complacent and you are having a piece in that. You know, if you're a white-bodied person and you have some sort of power, even if it's time is very powerful. Time is something that my communities don't always have, because we're working 2 and 3 jobs, or because we're taking care of so many people, you know, because we're family oriented. I think, and because we don't have the money to like to just go out here and volunteer all the time. I think that's why I was pretty successful as doing this work, because like I was on Section 8 and I had lots of time. But I think people have to start joining into these conversations like zoning, because zoning is actually some of the reasons why these hotspots were created. So these industrial areas were created specifically in communities that our government probably deemed as, you know, just undesirable people. So undesirable people, undesirable communities, and they kind of laid the groundwork for the situation that we have now. So now it's people's opportunities to tap into that and make a difference. So check that out. Try to get in where you fit in. But yeah, MCEA and CMEJ are looking closely at zoning changes underway within the city of Minneapolis. Saw Evan throw that in the chat, or Adam, and we do hope that people come to this meeting that's happening tomorrow, because the city is kind of on a fast timeline, which is, again, it's another part of how our system does things. They have no real goals of creating transparency or accountability or communication and building relationships with community. They just kind of like go. They make these decisions, whether or not they come from diverse communities or not, whether they're not recognizing the privilege that they have, and they are making these laws on behalf of hundreds of thousands of people. And so it's really important that communities moves fast like them. Even, if you have the opportunity, please join tomorrow and learn a little bit more, and stay tuned, and, try to watch MCEA's website and CMEJ's social media pages. We are working kind of overtime right now to figure out how to get the community involved, how they can make public comments. And yeah, you have an opportunity, I think, to type into the chat public comment tomorrow at this meeting online. But I mean, it's really a tight deadline. And we did just get an extension. MCEA and CMEJ, we had a letter requesting a 30-day extension so that people can actually get an opportunity to look at this 300+ page document of zoning laws with no table of contents, and try to like understand the language, and then create some sort of a public comment to turn in, and hope that the city staff take into account what we're saying before they make recommendations back to the city council. So it's a lot, and we need help. We need help out here. So thank you. That might have been a little long-winded, but thank you.
Thanks, Roxxanne. Andrea, there's a bunch of chat questions. You want to pull some out and ask
Yeah,
them?
I've been looking at some of those. There's one that I particularly kind of noted a while ago that I want to make sure that we talk about, and that is the balance of economic development and adverse health impacts. This has been a big meat of the conversation as we've been negotiating with the MCEA on their bill language, and talking with other stakeholders and all of our coalition members is, what does it mean that it has a community benefit? What does it mean that it adds to the public interest? And is economic development a part of that? And so, I think it's a great question to ask everybody who's been part of this bill language drafting, is like, how did we balance that? And how did we talk about economic development?
Yeah, I feel like this is a big question that we are all on a very serious spectrum, I think, also about. But navigating the conversation around that, I think something that we really sat with was, what does it look like for community to have decision making in that process? And so that's why different community benefit agreements and other things like that have been built into this bill, and being very intentional about who is quote unquote community, or what does that look like, knowing that there have been problems with community benefit agreements in the past, people making agreements with people that aren't actually going to be directly affected. I'm gonna go on mute because my door is really loud at my house.
We can't hear it. It's okay. I'll just describe the bill a little bit. It's my understanding that the bill has basically, it says if you're going to add to the cumulative impact, you can't issue the permit, but there's an exception if it's going to have some sort of community benefit, a public interest exception to this. Like if there's something that the community is in favor of and there's a community benefit agreement in place, then that extra pollution would be allowed because there's an offsetting sort of benefit to the people and the community. So that, I think that's what the bill is contemplating.
I think also just one other conversation that this coalition has had is this bill is not the end point, this is just the beginning. And so there are other legislative choices and things that will have to be written up and moved forward beyond this cumulative impacts bill to actually support communities in transitioning into more clean choices for energy usage and other things. And I think that that's another, next phase of what is, okay, this is happening. We can approve this and make sure nothing more is going to be polluting. And also, what is our commitment to supporting people in transitioning into other forms that are more sustainable? Because I think that you have to do both. You can't just stop something and say, now you can't have something. You have to say, hey, I want to support you in this work and in transitioning towards the future. Also, I am reading way too many of these questions in here. And I'm just going to say we're not saying the number of the bill intentionally because it hasn't been posted yet. And that's where I'm going to land that.
I'll elaborate on that a little bit. So we do have a bill number that's gone through the revisor's office. It's kind of it's a really complicated process for to explain like all the details of how we're doing this, but essentially we're amending the bill that is currently in the version through the revisor's office. So the bill number is House File 637 or Senate File 466, but that's not the language that's actually going to be going through. So I want to be clear that like if you go look for that bill, that's not the right language. And that will be available once we get the hearing scheduled for the cumulative impacts bill, which is one of our asks, is that you encourage your legislators to hear the bill and support the bill as we've amended it from last year's language.
There was also a question in the chat that I thought was a great question. I accidentally pressed that I answered it or that it was done. And so I want to get to that. It was a question around what happened to the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's Citizens Board, not this new community advisory board that they have. And I just think that brings up a really good point around what happens when communities start standing up and speaking out about things that are happening in our communities. Then lobbyists and business comes, and what they do is they create these bills or they create laws based on them being worried about, communities having too much power, communities showing up and actually speaking against corporate interests, but for the betterment of their community. So they're speaking up about these things, and then corporations go to the state or the cities, and then they create these laws that will continue to allow them to do that, to do whatever they're trying to do, even if it's harmful to our communities. And I think that was a good example that happened around the time that Northern Metals communities were coming out in full force around getting Northern Metals out of here or stopping them from increasing their pollution. Right around that time, and there was also other things going on, mining companies, there was other issues happening. I think that it was lobbied to basically destroy that committee. So that's a great question. I think that if somebody wanted to take that initiative, that's all we do in our communities is when something's pissing us off or we feel like something needs to be changed, we start asking questions. We start going to whoever makes these decisions, figure out the history, find out what happened, and then, make an ask or make a demand and get people on your side, get people on your team from your neighborhoods, make calls, do emails, call your mayor, call the governor, call everybody. And until you're bothering people to the point where all they're hearing about is what happened to this MCEA Citizens Board, and sometimes that's just how change happens. So, if anybody's moved, it's an issue I can't take on right now, but I definitely would stand behind it.
I also saw this question of, is there resistance against it? Why and who from? I think we're going to find out who the resistance is very quick. And when that's found out, I would be happy to flag some of that publicly for other people. But I think I foresee some resistance in commerce, and when people are talking about economic development, business development, those things, I think that is a very safe thing to say, that there is probably going to be pushback from people that were going to financially gain, that are no longer going to be able to do so due to this bill. So that is just my thought on that question.
Can I add to that too, Sophia? So this happened in New York, where Like they wanted to put a bunch of different trash transfer stations around in different parts of the city. And they realized that if they're going to put it in a neighborhood that has a lot of power, that's a mainly white neighborhood, they're going to have to do a lot more pollution control or people are going to get really upset. And so you see this happening where like companies want to do the least possible, and then they do it in a neighborhood that already has a lot of pollution where people aren't paying attention, and it's harming people of color and Black people, Indigenous people who don't have a lot of power. So you end up with the situation that we're trying to stop here with this bill. So that's like, it's some of the sort of the background, just description of what happens in cities. So
One of our listeners, Marita Beaujou, is on here. I just want to give her a shout out from St. Paul. Just a wonderful human being out here, but also has a bill at the state that we also started with Food League, probably around 2018, same time as cumulative bill. It's called the Food Farm, well, they're calling it the Headwaters Bill now, but it's the Food Farm and Water Bill. It's about giving subsidies to rural farmers, indigenous farmers, urban farmers, local farmers, people who actually are being more regenerative with our earth and actually creating the majority of the food. Because as of right now, we're facing a crisis with the way that the industrial food industry exploits our water. So shout outs to her and Fuli for starting that, coming together. We kind of came together and threw that together. And now there's like possibly, I think like 20 plus public officials also supporting that bill. So just another EJ bill I want to give a shout out to, because I see she made a comment in here and I didn't want that to go unseen and unheard.
Yeah, and I see that we're running close to the end of time here, so I want to make sure that that we have time to answer some of these burning questions and do our best at answering things that are here. And so if there's anything that sticks out to any of you three, please feel free to jump at that. Otherwise, I can sort of call out some of these other questions here. So one that I'll start with, there's a question here regarding EP&I and how this bill might affect that. Evan, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the East Phillips work and, you know, what, if anything, could this bill do or could it have done?
that's a hard question. I know that the community in East Phillips and the East Phillips Neighborhood Institute and the people who care about what's going on there are sort of, they're feeling down today because the injunction did not come through and the city is going to continue to move towards demolition. How would this have affected it? It's hard to know. The facility that the city's trying to put in there in East Phillips didn't require an air permit, so that's part of the problem. But I'm optimistically, if this bill were in place and you would have had to look at all the different permits from the state and all the different types of existing pollutions and all the different types of health impacts. And I'm hoping that this bill would have at least required them to do more controls, more change the project somewhat, hopefully maybe stop it, because what that project is doing, it's adding dozens and dozens and hundreds of more truck trips, diesel fueling stations, and all the rest in a place with lots of asthma and lots of people dying and going to the hospital from health impacts from pollution. Some of it's the roads, some of it's the other industries. And, you know, it just boils down to, it doesn't make sense to do anything in a place like that that adds harm to people who are most oppressed and most vulnerable to air pollution, water pollution, etc. And it's wrong. The city should stop, but they're not going to. I don't know how else to say anything about that.
Do you think that this bill could have prevented a situation from what's going on right now, like this cumulative effects bill? Do you think it would have had impact on something like that?
Well, if the MCEA has something to do with that, and I don't know if it does. I don't think the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency has anything to do with it. But a cumulative impact ordinance at the city level, that might do something. That might have, which is good while we're at the state level right now, because sometimes people need to see that things are winnable in order to join. It's unfortunate, once again, because I like to try to shoot for the impossible sometimes. And I mean, that's how you actually can see if you can get something. But I think we need to, you know, you can always stop something. Nothing is set in stone. You just have to believe that you can fight it, you know. But I think that the state bill, I'm not sure. I actually would need to phone a friend for that. But I think it's more about the state, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's power at the state level.
I mean, I sort of think about what we're fighting for, and it's really this vision of that we're trying to fix these patterns and make sure that people who have been harmed, particularly Black people, people of color, Indigenous people, like, are not continually harmed more than they already are. And I have this vision for a city and a metro and a state where, like, we don't have so much harmful pollution, like killing people. Like, that's the thing that we're trying to come up like I see a different way of living, and we could just have to keep moving towards that.
Noting that we only have a couple minutes left, I'm hoping to maybe kind of end us with one question to all the panelists, and that is, with everybody who's watching today and tuning in and watching at maybe another time, what would you suggest each of these individuals could do today to make a difference in environmental justice work? What would you like to see people do?
I have two quick things. One is call your legislator and tell them to support the strongest version of this bill, the Fully version of this bill, and the Frontlines version of this bill. And number two, it's collective action. You know, like, sitting at home thinking about things, wishing they were better, isn't changing anything. What you need to do is find people to work with and join a group that's doing something that you care about. That's the way to move forward. I'll stop.
I would say I would agree with that, Evan. Yes, don't get off this call with all this good information and do absolutely nothing. You know, please, not just send money. Again, that is super helpful. I don't want to say that that's not, but I do want to say we need you. We need your voices. We need your support. We need your empathy. We need your understanding. And we need you to get involved. We need you to get engaged. And how you can do that, like Evan said, you can call your legislator. You can support this bill that frontline communities, Frontline Coalition, and frontline community members like me have been working hard on this bill. I know I've been in it since 2018, so a lot of 5 years, and we really want to get this bill passed, but we don't want it to be watered down. I'm not really sure I haven't read the governor's, the governor's office just sent their version today over email to us, but I haven't looked at it yet. But I know that, you know, there might not be strong teeth in the governor's bill. It might be something that corporations are really comfortable with, and we need something that community members will be healthy with. So that would be Fully's bill. But also shout outs to Representative Bobby Joe Champion, who has the companion bill in the Senate, and he's the head of like the Senate committee. But we're hoping, we've put a lot of work into Fully's bill. So we appreciate the governor's office. We appreciate Senator Bobby Joe Champion, because we did ask him to do a companion bill. We just want you to know that we worked the hardest on making Fully's bill the strongest. So support that bill. And if you can come to the meeting tomorrow at the city, the zoning committee meeting, I think maybe they can throw it in the chat again, because we need people to make public comments around that. And we're going to send out some action information and steps soon because we know that this document, people really don't understand it. Like, I can barely understand it. Lawyers can barely understand it. It's not an easy document to digest. So we're trying to take bits and pieces of what we do, what we can define and what we can't understand. And we're going to share it very soon with community so that you kind of have an idea on what we're thinking, what we're seeing, and what we're needing. And then you can maybe just take bits and pieces of what fits with you and what you're hoping to advocate for. And you can send those comments out, or you can join the meeting. And I think you can write your comments in the chat. I think it's technically a public comment. So yeah, we just need help. We need help. I think we got maybe 30, 35, 36 days left to make these public comments. We were only given 45 days, and then they just gave us a 30-day extension. So yes, please make a comment. Please show up.
Sophia?
I resonate with what everyone else is saying. I will keep mine short and swift. First of all, we mentioned the Herc incinerator. We have a petition moving, so I would love for folks to sign that. I'm going to try to get someone to drop the link. I'm just going to paste it here and hope that it gets somewhere that people can receive it, because I don't think I have access to the external chat. And then, yeah, I also think just the last thing is this is a never-ending fight to undo what's been built up all of these years. We've talked about zoning and all these other efforts that have created racially focused, pollution, given power to the wrong people, blah, 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 blah. My whole point is that I also think it's really important to push when you're voting, to actually push people to have better platforms and actually follow through on them. So it's not a one-time thing. You can call folks now, but I think in the long run, every single election, really supporting folks to push their platforms to further lengths and follow through on their commitments that they've made. So that would be my last thing.
Thank you, all of the panelists. I think this conversation has been really good. I would encourage you all to follow the link that will be put in the chat in a second for our action alert that you can follow through and participate in to push your legislator to support the cumulative impacts bill, the strongest version of that bill out there. So I wanted to thank again all the panelists for this great conversation and for everybody's work. What you're seeing here is just the tip of the iceberg in the amount of work that is going into this. And this has been a really long effort. And so thank you everybody for how much you're doing for our communities. And so one last time, I would like to encourage you all to both follow the action alerts and if you are so inclined, donate to our collective organizations if you are so inclined. And thanks everybody for tuning in today.
Thanks, everybody.